Good evening, afternoon, or morning. I hope you're having a good day. This time on PLO Order video, the topic is different opponent types. How to adjust to different opponent types and more how to identify those ones. And one of my favorite topics, because I like to exploit people. Let's get started. First, let's talk about categorizing. And in order to identify opponents, we need to have subcategories of different types of opponents. And we're using the following method. First, hand selection, pretty much VPIP. And it can be tight or it can be loose, but it's never black and white. You can't just say that, okay, everything before this is tight, everything after this is loose, but it's a spectrum. We have extreme ends on people who have VPIP4. I've seen those. And on the other hand, we have the other end of the spectrum, VPIP100. You've seen those. But most players are somewhere in between. And as we can say, what is the threshold of being tight or loose, we know that the other end of the spectrum is considered tight, the other end is considered loose. People in between are something in between. And the other type of categorizing is aggression. And same thing, it can be passive or it can be aggressive. And once again, there's a spectrum. So we have two categories, and every player, their hand selection is somewhere on the spectrum, their aggression is somewhere on the spectrum. And to make simple, or to make our life simple, we just say that player is either tight or loose, and he's either passive or aggressive. So we take the extreme ends of the spectrums. So we have two categories with two possibilities. We combine those, and in the end, we get four basic types of players. And those four types are tight passive. We combine tightness and passiveness. Then we combine looseness and passiveness. That gives us loose passive player type. And then same with tight ones, we have tight aggressive and loose aggressive. So there we have four basic types of poker players. And other words for these are tight passive, often called nit, loose passive, often called calling station, tight aggressive, regular, and then loose aggressive, often conferred maniac. So we have four different basic types of player. And now we're going to focus on these stereotypes or basic types. And the first one is tight passive. He has low VPIP, tight hand selection, and he has low aggression. So he doesn't play much, and when he does, he plays passively. Often called nit, rock. Loved Baby has a lot of names. The distinctive feature on this kind of player is that he doesn't like to play big pot without nuts. So the basic idea is that he's not comfortable in stacking off unless he has the stone cold nuts. And the further he is from having the nuts, the less he wants to stack off often. And often these kind of players, they don't like uncertainty. They don't like to stack off on the flop with top set because they are afraid that draw might get there. They are not playing combo draws aggressively because they want to hit the draw first and then put money to the pot. So they don't like to gamble, they like to be safe. The way you gain edge or how you exploit this kind of player is to apply pressure. It's that easy. This kind of player is always looking reasons to fold. The thinking process in his head he's always looking reasons to fold a hand unless he has a really strong hand. Like medium strength hand, not comfortable putting money to the pot. If you give him a good reason to fold his hand, he will. So you exploit him by just applying pressure on the flops, on the turns, on the rivers, whenever you think he might have a weak range. But when he raises, you have to respect his raises. No matter what kind of situation it is you think he's bluffing, tight passive players don't bluff that much. So when he raises, you should be prepared for him having the nuts and then play accordingly. And from these players, it's really hard to win big pots unless it's a setup. So often you make money in the long run by collecting those small pots. And make sure that if you ever end up in a big pot, you do have good hand. And it's plus EV for you. But yeah, I mean, the idea is that if he folds a lot on the flop, and let's say on the flop the pot is 7 BBs and you see bet, if you steal 5 of those pots, you already make like 30 big blind profits. And then when he raises you once, you lose that flop C bet of 5 BB or something. So you pick multiple small ones. When he shows interest to the pot, you give up to the next hand, start grinding those small pots. And from those small pots, you start to make profit. Next one is lose passive. So passive player, but instead of having tight pre-flop brains, this guy plays almost everything. High VPIP, low aggression. Other words, calling station, or how I refer to them, good customer. The thing is that these players like to chase. If they have a draw, they call it. They don't care about probabilities. These are the players who think that slot machines are plus EV. It's just a matter of how you press the buttons. So they chase cut shots. They don't know how often it hits. For them, every draw is 50-50. Either it hits or it doesn't. And it's about their feeling. Do I have a feeling that my cut shot will be there? I need a 10 on the river, but I feel like I'm going to get it. So I call a pot size raise. And most of the times, these players don't really care about your range or what you represent. They are looking at their own cards and just play accordingly. So you have to play straightforward. Don't do anything fancy-pancy. These players call a lot and they rarely raise. So once again, respect their raises. But if you start to do some kind of merge, triple barrel bluffs, don't. Don't raise river with ace blocker and hope he folds a flush. He's not. So understand how the other player thinks about poker. When he calls a lot, the way we exploit this kind of player is value betting, and then we value bet, and on the third point we value bet. Don't bluff. You don't make money by bluffing calling stations. You make money by value betting. And the key is to start making pots bigger on the flop. Often I see that people slow play on the flop to be deceptive or something, and it always hurts my heart. And it makes my brain hurt, because the thing is, if you bet on the flop, let's say the pot is 7 or 8 BPs, and you check the flop, then you get to the turn, and the turn pot is still 8 BPs, you bet 6 BPs, he calls, on the river pot is 20 BPs, you value bet 15 BPs, he calls, because he has a hand, you have a good hand, and you feel happy about it, you got 21 BPs as value post-flop. Alright, what if you bet the flop? Pot is 8 BPs, you bet the flop, 6 BPs. He calls, on the turn pot is 20 BPs, you bet 15 BP. He calls, on the river, pot is 50 BPs. you bet 35, he calls. And you just won 35 BBs more. Instead of 21 that you get when you check the flop, now you get 56 big blinds as value. So the difference is huge. So don't slow play ever versus these players. And if you are not sure about sizing, go for a bigger one. These players make call downs. Any flush, call 3 straight. So you can just even pot. If they call the flop on monotone board, go big on the turn and river. Because there's a huge difference on your river sizing, how much you bet on the flop and turn. I mean, 1 BB more on the flop means 2 BBs more on the turn, with turns into 4 BBs more on the river. Then we have the side aggressive, scary stormtrooper. Low VPIP, high aggression. Not as low as tight passive, probably, but very selected hand selection. And this should be you. You should be that beautiful stormtrooper. Often called rep, which means for regular, DAC, tight aggressive, grinder, and most of the time this kind of player is a member of a poker side. It means that he often evolves. Some tight aggressive or regulars evolve and play better faster than others. Some play the same games after 10 years. But sometimes they might see a video, they evolve their game a little. Some guys evolve fast. And the important thing to accept is that this kind of player type might be better than you. If you think that you are the end boss of the stage you're playing, like you're the best player on the network, that's probably not true. So these kind of players might be better than you, so don't think that they are bad. If they do something that seems strange to you, don't automatically assume that it's bad. Think why they did that. Are they actually doing bad things, or do they know something you don't? It's really hard to have a big enough edge to beat the rate versus these people, because on PLO, average rate is around 15 to 20 BBs per 100. So your edge versus this kind of player in the long run should be more than that, and then it's pretty hard to get. How you adjust versus these kind of players? Well, the first thing is go for defense. And now defense means go for balanced strategies. Exploiting opponents is our offense, and being balanced is our defense. So actually this is the one player type whose strategy might be better than yours. So you need to defend yourself. So be more balanced. If you don't know how, then learn. Go for solver strategies. Don't be too predictable. And at the same time, try to find tendencies that you can exploit. Because if we are talking about small stakes, there's always a reason why someone plays PLO then. And very often it means their strategy is not good enough to crush PLO then, go to PLO 25, PLO 50, PLO 100, and so on. Something is holding them back. And if you find those tendencies or areas where you can exploit the opponent, it's better for you. Even if he's a better player, but if you can, let's say, he's making 5 BB per 100 out of you, he's a better player. But if you can reduce that to 2 BB per 100 versus that player, it's going to impact your win rate. So try to minimize the edge opponent has versus you, or try to maximize your edge over that opponent. An important thing is to silence your ego. If you have this delusional thought that you are the best player always on the table, and then there's that stormtrooper, and if you think that he has nothing on me, I'm going to show him who's the better player. Now, that's not strategy talking, that's ego talking. And if you let your ego control your actions, then you're probably doing bad strategical decisions, which means that the stormtrooper is taking your money. So you have to accept that he might be a better player than you. And the last one is loose aggressive, high VPIP, and high aggression. Often referred as lack, loose aggressive, maniac, donkey, bowling ball. These guys have a lot of names. They like to bully on the table and just force people to fold with constant aggression, triple barrels, raising a lot. And there's a huge difference between controlled and uncontrolled aggression. And the first thing when you have these loose aggressive players on the table is to figure out whether the aggression is controlled or whether the aggression is uncontrolled. And the difference is that uncontrolled is just saying, fuck ranges, I'm going to pot. So uncontrolled aggression means that he doesn't think about ranges. He is just being aggressive for the sake of it on a constant basis. Controlled aggression is that he understands ranges and he understands when he can be very aggressive and he understands when to shut down. And sometimes he might even make traps with slow playing when he has the nuts. And versus controlled aggression, it's really hard to play against, especially if the aggressive player has position. It's really hard. And versus uncontrolled aggression, where the opponent is just putting everything, it gets a bit more easier. But if it's controlled aggression, it's probably one of the hardest opponents you will face. Versus aggression, we don't necessarily fight fire with fire. If he puts every hand, we put every hand, no one is winning. But in counter strategy, the idea is like in martial arts. You use your opponent's weakness against him. And for each opponent or player's type, you have to understand the weaknesses in his strategies. There aren't perfect strategies. And versus aggression, you give rope. Give him a rope and he will hang himself. Don't be too predictable. The worst way to play versus aggressive player is to call with draws, raise with strong hand. It's so easy for an aggressive player to play against you. He keeps picking out. It's like you playing versus Nit. You pick a lot of small pots, and when opponent shows interest, you give up. And rinse and repeat. Same with aggressive players. If you always raise when you have a strong hand, they just give up when you raise and keep picking up those small pots. So sometimes you slow play, strong hands, and of course every time when we check call with the set on the flop, there's a chance turn completes a draw. So sometimes it sucks, but you can get really good payout. But you have to know when to commit yourself, when to give that rope. And first thing I would do versus aggressive player is to tighten your pre-flop range a little. If opponent 3-bets a lot, open only hands that you're happy to 4-bet or call a 3-bet. If he 3-bets decently, then every time when you open a hand, first think, how do I react if he 3-bets? And when you have a bit stronger pre-flop range, it means you will hit the flop a bit stronger. And often the most problematic hands versus aggressive players are medium strength hits. Try overpairs on the flop. Naked, medium strength flush draws. Middle pair with cut shot. Those kind of hands are problematic because we don't know how to play them those versus those aggressives. Should we just call and then fold turn? Should we raise, get it in? But if your pre-flop range is tighter, you will have a bit easier decisions post-flop. Of course, the hits on the flop will be stronger. And the most important thing is have a plan on the flop. Pre-flop is easy. Then when you get to the flop, have a plan. Because if you just think that, okay, he's betting everything on the flop, you're calling white on the flop, it means on the turn, most of the times you don't have a strong hand, and then he barrels, and you have to fold, and now you're just handing him your money. Calling a lot of flops, folding a lot of turns, or calling a lot of turns, folding a lot of rivers, doesn't work versus aggressive. Call flop with hands that you can often call the turn or raise the turn. And so you need to have a plan. The last thing versus aggressive players is embrace the variance. Versus these players, the variance goes pew all the way through the roof. You can easily lose 10 buy-ins in 15 minutes versus these players. You just lose the flips, setups, don't hit your hands. But when you do hit, your hands hold, you can win a lot of money from these ones. But you have to accept the variance if you decide to stay on the table. If you have a maniac on your table, and let's say you're deep, 200 pips deep, then don't complain that variance struck you. If you stay on the table, you know there's going to be variance. And if you're not ready to embrace it, find a new table. There's a lot of tables open on poker sites. You don't have to play with the aggressive guy if you don't want. Alright, how to spot those ones? The thing is that I didn't give you any VPIP threshold or aggression threshold, any stats how to spot the opponent. Remember, we're talking about spectrums. And if you have a heart, it helps a lot. If you don't, you don't. But you don't need a heart. You need to pay attention. You need to make notes. And you know your pre-flop hand selection, because you should have a decent pre-flop strategy. If you don't, then shame on you. Go and practice it. It's easy and free. So if anyone plays tighter than you, you know that, okay, he's tight. And if he plays a lot of hands you wouldn't, okay, he's probably a bit loose. But where is the threshold? Or is VPIP 35 loose? 39? 43? Where's the difference between loose and tight? There's no threshold. You just work on the spectrum. The more he's towards the looseness, the more you adjust, in a way you adjust to the loose opponents. And the more he's on the aggression spectrum, the more you adjust how you would adjust to aggressive players. And make notes. It's so easy. And use color coding. That's how I have been using color coding for years, and it's working really well for me. 4 player types, 4 colors, and often I can see one hand, how the opponent played the hand. I can say that, okay, that's a nit. Oh, that's a calling station. Ooh, that's quite aggressive player. Okay, that's a regular. So, and I can instantly keep a color code. If something changes, then I change the color code. But it helps a lot. And I said, starting hand reveals VPIP. When hands go to showdown, if you're not in the hand, pay attention. Every time when you see a showdown, you see that, okay, that player played that kind of hand that way. It might reveal a lot about his overall strategy. And if you can profile him to certain player type, you already know how to adjust. You don't need 100 hands on HUD. Sometimes one hand gives you enough information that you can start to adjust a little. And you can use that adjustment until you know better. Okay, one hand looks like calling station, I start to adjust. Then after 10 hands, it seems that, okay, he's more of a regular. Or he's more of an aggressive player who just decided to be passive on one hand for some reason. I change my coding, I change my adjustment. That's how it works. And starting hand reveals VPIP, then aggression reveals aggression. And that sounds pretty simple, but it is. If you see a player make a river bluff or triple barrel bluff with a hand you would, there's no logical reasoning, there's a high chance he's aggressive. 3 hands in a row he 3-bet someone and is aggressive on the flop. Probably aggressive player. 5 hands where he makes barreling bluffs post-flop with bad hand, high chance he's an aggressive player. The key is to profile the opponent and use those 4 stereotypes, basic types of player, as a base for profilement. You can make notes how he plays certain hands. And when and if you get good in profiling opponents, you get to understand how this player thinks about poker. How is he playing this game? How he approaches poker. And then, like in old school, they say that you get into his head. We're not literally reading his mind, but we understand how he thinks. And we step one step higher. And we start to adjust and exploit. And we print money. Edge means profiting. And when we talk about edge, it means that for some reason we make money out of the opponent. And now we're talking about skill edge. We could also have positional edge or range edge, but now we're talking about skills. And our skill edge versus these 4 types of player comes in following order. Our highest edge is versus loose passive players, calling stations. Those are the ones who gives us most profits. So you want to play as much with them as possible. The second best payout are loose aggressive players. There's high variance, but they have a lot of flaws in their strategy, and if you know how to exploit that, you can make good money out of them. Third one is tight passive, the nits. Our edge is not huge, but we definitely have them. They are not outplaying us. I mean, if opponent is outplaying you, he has better strategy than you, then he has the edge. But if he doesn't, then you have the edge. Whether it's enough to beat the rate, that's a whole different conversation. And then the last is tight aggressive. And now the thing is that there's that red line. Versus the top 3 player types, you should have an edge. If you know how to play versus them, you should have an edge. But versus tight aggressives, you might not have edge. The opponent might be better. And the key is to have predictable players on your left and unpredictable on your right, if possible. And out of these, often the only really truly unpredictable player is tight aggressive, because they're balanced. And none of the top 3 is balanced unless you have controlled aggression, which is huge problems. But you don't mind, I mean, if you come to the table and there's 2 seats you can select from, and you have color coding on the people so you already know what kind of opponents you have, then try to make those regulars to your right so you have position, or aggressives. And versus loose passives, tight passives, it doesn't really matter whether you have position or not, because you often control the pots. And when you're playing, it's important to constantly ask yourself, where does my money come from? If I have 5 opponents on the table, who is my target player? Who is the best profit for me? Versus whom I have the highest edge? And then the thing comes that if all 5 opponents are tight aggressives, then it's really hard to beat the rate on small stakes, even if you're a better player. But it's really hard to get a long run EV of over 15 BP per 100 versus those players. So if you don't have loose passives, loose aggressives, or tight passives on your table, change the table. And tight passive, remember, you might not beat the rate versus them either. So I would say that if you don't have loose passives or loose aggressives, change the table. You need loose people. So if everyone has VPIP 30 or less, probably not a good table. See if you can find a better one. Right. We didn't go too deeply on the stats, actual exploits. Now it's already half an hour. We scratched the surface. But I hope the video gave you some kind of ideas on how to profile opponents, what kind of opponents we have, and how to adjust. Because when you know the basic principles of how to adjust versus each type of player, you don't need HUD to exploit people. You don't need a lot of hands or sample sizes to exploit people. Sometimes you need a couple of hands and you can instantly mark them a certain type, and then you already know the overall ways to exploit those kind of players, which helps you improve in your win rate. Alright? I will see you on the PLO Order videos and on the Discord. Have a safe time on the galaxy. Bye bye.